right, so thank you for coming.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Joshua Shipp, and
I'm Lena Coleman.
Yeah, and here we're kind of doing a follow-up to a talk we did before, which we called Biological Mythbusters. Last time we had some things that we weren't able to get to, so we tried to cover some new material in this lecture, particularly looking at evolutionary history. So look at misconceptions people have about the history of evolution. Hopefully you'll find it interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, thank you.
All right,
Okay.
so you want to go to the next?
Okay, so I'm going to get started.
So I just have a little outline
Okay.
here. So Lena is first going to cover how to properly read family trees or phylogenies. And she'll talk about mistakes that are common in textbooks and documentaries, mistaking cousins for ancestors. And then I'll talk a little bit about the myth of the caveman, and then also go over the very incomplete fossil record. So kind of problems and just how sparse the fossil record is, particularly for certain organisms. So Lena will start by talking about reading family trees, so you can take it away.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Lena Coleman, and I'm a biology teacher here at ABC. And I think this is just something that as science educators, as biologists, it's something we see kind of popping up time and time again. And I think maybe the biggest problem with it is kind of having this inaccurate representation of evolution put out there kind of leads to misunderstandings about it. And I think there's actually, pretty simple corrections that we can make to understanding it. And part of that has to do with teaching people how to read something called a phylogeny, or for me to just use a simple term, a family tree. Actually, let me do this first, all right? And then, because I'm going to use the drawing function on here.
Oh, okay.
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 So before I show you these evolutionary family trees, what I'd like to do is kind of show you something about just how does evolution run in general. So that'll kind of hopefully make sense of these family trees for you. So if I go here, and I'm going to do this way so that I can get the draw function. All right, let me go to this one actually first, and I'll play this as part of my slideshow. All right, and so let's say in general we have a species that's just existing out in the world. So let's say my sample species is this squirrel population here, all right? And just in general, it's going to be evolving through time. Things like natural selection, something else called genetic drift, are going to exert pressures on this population and change them over time. They may get new adaptations to a changing climate. Things are going to go on that through time are going to change this population. All right, so generally through time, evolution will change this single group, right? But what happens if, let's say, for example, a mountain range cuts off this group into two separate populations, all right? And so now because of that, these two groups are isolated from each other. So essentially, reproduction between the two groups, it has now ceased, all right? And that's kind of the important ingredient into how something called speciation occurs. So in evolution, that can explain why species have adaptations, but it can also explain the diversity of life we see on Earth as well. And it's not a separate process. And even speciation, kind of like the giving rise of a new species, is not something separate from evolution. It's kind of a byproduct of that. It's not its own special process. All right, so let's say this happens. And now, before we had one single group, now we have these two separate groups. All right. So let's say in our top group, in that particular environment, they have hawks that are predators, all right? And let's say in our bottom group, they have primarily rattlesnakes that are predators, all right? And so because they have two different kind of predation predators, it's going to be the case that maybe, what's adaptive against this predator up here is not really what's adaptive against a rattlesnake, because hawks have really good vision, but rattlesnakes kind of hunt by heat signature. So maybe these guys are going to kind of evolve to blend in more with their environment. And let's say, just as an example, that these guys, some of them start to get larger, and that's adaptive for kind of surviving predation by these rattlesnakes, all right? And let's say up here on the top, all right, let's say in this group, it's the case that, you know, there's changing climate through time. Let's say it starts that there's forests growing in this habitat. All right, oops, I did this one first. So let me talk about this one. So in this one, let's say that this community experiences wildfires. It kind of happened to take out some of the organisms down here. And it kind of happened, like in the beginning, they were a mixture of small and large. And now, let's say they're kind of mostly large, all right? So over time, you get this larger population of squirrels down here. Up here, again, let's say because of changing climate, it starts to be the case that it's adaptive for them. Maybe there's food to kind of move into the trees. And so let's say they start to look like this. All right, so let's compare these two groups. So number one, what you see is that, remember, they were once the same group, kind of on a single evolutionary trajectory. And now, because of separation, they're on their own evolutionary paths, right? And natural selection and evolution is going to proceed in each of these groups, but separately. And typically, because they're separated, it's in their own way, all right? And so if you look, all right, what we have now after the split is different from what we had originally, all right? The other thing to kind of take from this is that as time goes on, what do you think? Are they going to get more and more different? Are those differences going to accumulate? Yeah. So if you kind of look here at them, maybe they looked a little bit more similar to what they were in the past. So one thing to kind of take from this is as time goes on and they get more and more different, the relationship between those two groups changes through time. It doesn't stay the same. Like when they were just initially here versus if we let this go for 100,000 more years, those two groups at the end are not the same, all right, relation-wise as this group to this group, all right? So now let me show you how we could kind of like draw that in a more simple form, all right? So we have this single group here, and let's see, let me make sure this is a good pen size. Okay, so let's say there's a single group, just kind of going on, evolving, and then you have something that separates the groups, all right? So now they're own two separate groups, and so they start to diverge, all right? But ultimately, as time goes on, more and more divergence accumulates as they're just on their own separate evolutionary paths. And so in the diagrams that I'm going to show you, they're alluding to this, all right? The diagrams are a representation of this, right? And, showing that, this group here was once, these two groups were once a single group, and then also that.
I'm just, sorry, I'm some people.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that, this is ancestral. They would have things in common with all of their descendants here, okay? So you can play it, and you can click on this one first, and then play it on this one. Okay. Okay. So, so kind of like the evolutionary history. So what I just showed you. So let's say the two modern groups of squirrels that we had came from this one single ancestral group. So kind of the evolutionary history of a group is called a phylogeny. Okay? And you can summarize phylogenies in something called a phylogenetic tree, like this one here for a group of butterflies, how they're related to each other. And what it's going to show you is this pattern of ancestors and descendants. And because of that, it's going to tell you how they're related to each other as well. So you can think of it as a family tree. So I'm going to show it to you with a family tree, because the same rules that apply to a family group would apply to a bigger group of organisms. Actually, it applies to any kind of group of related things. I'll show you that in a second as well. Okay. So you can do these phylogenies, which we can just call a family tree diagram. You can do that for an actual family, like this one here is the Habsburg family tree. All right, you can do it for relatedness of DNA sequences, and therefore the organisms that possess those. You can do that for big groups of organisms. You can do it for any grouping size of organisms, and even things that are non-organisms. So go on. So this is a grouping of languages and how they're related to each other. And then here we have, again, the butterfly group. This is a group of mammals, all right? And so we can do this. It doesn't matter the size of the group. The relationship rules would still apply. Here's one for COVID virus. So, you can kind of make it as complicated as you want. I believe this would be based on RNA sequences, because it's an RNA virus. So, they would be using like the pattern of divergence to kind of track transmission. So you can relate like the patterns of their divergence over space through geography, and that'll kind of tell you kind of where separation happened as well. So those things kind of should relate to each other. Right. This is for all eukaryotic life. So what that means is we can kind of group all cells on Earth into two groups. Those that have a nucleus and those that don't. And our type of life would have a nucleus. So eukaryotes as a group is a very, very large group. It includes all plants, animals, fungi, and then a bunch of like single-celled groups, algae. And so this is looking at how they're related to each other. And this is based on looking at protein sequences and kind of similarities and differences among certain groups. So we're going to look at these to kind of help us understand some patterns, see through evolutionary history, and kind of dispel some common misconceptions. All right, so go ahead. Okay, so I'm going to use I promise I'm not going to do anything too complicated, and I made it like as simple as I could. All right, with explaining how to read a phylogenetic tree using a family group. Okay, so I'm going to have you, if you want, you can answer this for me as we do it. All right, so I have, let's say this is theoretically your family. All right, so I have you, your brother, and your parents down here. I have your grandparents, and let's say you have a cousin over here. So what does this phylogeny tell us? All right, so first of all, let me ask you this question. Who are you more closely related to? Your brother or your cousin? Your brother, right? Okay, who is your cousin more closely related to? You or your brother? Both, right? Is that a trick question? Yeah, it wouldn't make sense to say that you are, more related to one or the other, because you are both descendants of this point here. And so, you guys are equally related to us over here. All right? Would it make sense looking at this to say that you're descended from your cousin? No, right? Who are you and your brother descended from? Your parents, right? So on these diagrams, where you come to this point here, this is called a node. That's an ancestor. And everything past it is their descendants. All right? And so let's look here at this. All right? Who is the most common ancestor between you and your brother? Your parents, right? How about between you and your cousin? Grandparents, right? And so organisms or groupings that are more closely related, they have a more recent common ancestor than organisms that are less closely related. So if I say the question, who are you more closely related to? Your brother or your cousin? Just take those three things I asked you and compare them. So I said, you and your brother, or you and your cousin. So let's compare you and brother, comes back to here. But you and cousin, I have to go back to here. So you're more closely related to this group here. And that's when you're reading a phylogenetic tree, that's what you should be paying attention to. There's no relationship between that. You is closer to cousin. That doesn't mean anything about how they're related. It's who are these guys descended from that's giving us the patterns of relatedness. Okay? And so And on this one, as we go further back, this would be going further back in time, all right? And then would you also agree that the grandparents would have things in common with all of their descendants? Yeah, and the parents would too. They would have things in common with you and your brother, okay? So let's see. I have like a summary on the next one.
Okay.
Right? So for your group, your brother is your closest relative. Your parents, I put mom here, is your most recent common ancestor, all right, to both, all right? And that means they're the most recent group from which everyone in the group is descended from, all right? Groups that share a more recent common ancestor are more closely related. So you and your brother are more closely related than you and your cousin because you share this, where these two share this, all right? And then another point is that there's free rotation at any point. So would you agree that if I switch brother and you, that doesn't really change anything, right? It doesn't change the relationship because everybody past this point is equivalent, so it doesn't matter if we flip it. Okay. So now let's do this with a small part of the 8 family tree. Right, I have my husband Josh, him, right there as our example of humans. Okay.
Silverback.
Yeah.
Okay, so who are humans more closely related to? Chimpanzees or gorillas? How many of you say chimpanzee? Okay, how many of you say gorilla? Okay, it's chimpanzee, all right? Who are gorillas more closely related to? Chimpanzees or humans? Equal, right? So that's the same question. Can you go back a little bit? That's the same question saying, who's your cousin more closely related to, you or your brother? All right, so there's maybe a common misconception that we are evolved from chimpanzees, but that is not true because chimpanzees are a modern group. And the organism that would live back here, so remember the beginning slides that I showed you. What that is saying is that right here, kind of like all along here to here, this would have been a single group that somehow was split, all right? And they went on their own independent evolutionary trajectories. That's what this line is saying. And it happened approximately 6 million years ago, all right? And
Lena,
so,
Good question. Would it be okay to put the humans on this side and the chimpanzees on that side, or is there a particular
no,
protocol?
you can do that, yeah. And so at any point, you can flip it. There's free rotation.
Oh.
Now, what we couldn't do is switch chimpanzee and gorilla.
Yeah.
That would change the relationship. Right? So the ancestor that lived down here would have had things in common with all of its descendants, right? So to say this was a chimpanzee back here is just as much of a mistake as saying what was back here was a human, because these are equal here. And so to put this here would be the same as putting this here. All right, so this organism gave rise to both. Okay, let's see. Okay, so that's basically it. Like that's kind of as much as you really need to know to understand phylogenies in a fairly meaningful way, I think. But the problem is it hardly ever gets taught in a lot of modern institutions. And so oftentimes when people read this, maybe they kind of think, well, you know, over here is what was a long time ago. Then we had chimpanzees and we had humans and, you know, chimpanzees must be closer to gorillas. But that's not really true. What we should, this is just the end point. So what we should be really looking at is who are the ancestors and who are their descendants. And that tells you how things are actually related. Okay?
I think another misconception is that lines are representing one organism. Those lines actually represent multiple generations of population.
Yes.
Because there's a population that are so when that split happened between where Josh came eventually and the Tim, there's quite a bit of anagenesis going on within that, the population. There's some dead branches that we can show.
Yeah. You can kind of make the branches as detailed or as non-detailed as you want. Yeah.
That's one of the things I noticed with my students. They think, oh, there's just one animal kind of split into two. No, it's a population that evolved.
Right.
The good population split and the poor people.
Right. Okay, so let me test your knowledge. All right, I'm gonna see if you got this. Okay. All right. Who is this wolf? Who is Canis lupus, the gray wolf, more closely related to? The badger or the leopard? The badger, right? So I'm gonna do, I said wolf compared to badger, wolf compared to leopard. Wolf and badger come back to here. Wolf and leopard come back to here. So this is a more recent common ancestor. So these guys are more closely related. Okay? Who is the panther more closely related to, the coyote or the wolf? Are they equal? Yeah, they're equal because, do you see, to kind of ask that question, you're saying, you know, okay, like the coyote, who is its common ancestor with the panther? Well, that would be back here, right? How about the wolf? Same, all right? And again, it's kind of like anything that comes after this point is equivalent. So these guys are equally related to the panther. Okay, all right, let's go on. Okay, so one thing, so now that we have that understanding, let's kind of look at these mistakes or misinterpretations that can happen. All right, it's often misinterpreted kind of as the knowledge makes its way to the general public. All right, and a common misconception is that modern groups are the ancestors to other modern groups, kind of like we evolved from chimpanzees, kind of a mistake. All right, so you can see that in primary, secondary, and oftentimes even in college textbooks, that's the case. And another place where they do this all the time is in nature documentaries, like really good ones that I really enjoy watching and have a lot of good information from them, but they still kind of perpetuate that myth. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so in this one, what I'm showing you is a phylogeny or a family tree for vertebrate animals. And I'm going to kind of focus on the organisms that are called the tetrapods. So do you see this group right here? So all these guys, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals are called tetrapods. They're land vertebrates. And they would all have 4 limbs, right? When you think about it, mammals have 4 limbs, reptiles have 4 limbs, and amphibians do too. So they're called the tetrapods. And so we're going to look at a little bit of like their evolutionary history. Okay, so it's often the case, especially in nature documentaries, that this is the explanation. So a fish came out onto land, and then we have the rise of amphibians, and then the rise of reptiles, and then the rise of mammals. All right, so that's my biological myth, like number 1. All right, did that actually happen? Okay, go ahead. All right, so if you go to the 1926 time, all right, this is a great documentary. It's called Walking with
This is
Monsters.
Earth. 4 a long process
And
and legs began.
Okay, you can
Almost
set
there.
it there. It's okay.
Okay.
So this is called Walking with Monsters. It's by the BBC. It came out a while ago, but it has Kenneth Branagh narrating it. It's great. And it's on YouTube also. So I really recommend watching it. But I'm still going to complain about it for their misconceptions that they spread. Okay, so what they're talking, just to give you some reference, what they're talking about is an early ancestor to all tetrapods. All right, and go ahead and play it.
This is the giant amphibian, Hynerpeton, the prototype land dweller for the next 300 million years. Hynerpeton are over 1.5 meters in length much larger than most amphibians today. They carved out a home along the water's edge.
Okay, so some early organisms that, maybe as a paleontologist looking at them, would kind of describe these amphibian traits that you see in modern amphibians to these guys. All right, go on.
Do you want me to go to the?
You can, no, I'll come back to that one.
Okay.
So just go ahead.
Just play it?
No, just go past this whole thing.
Go to, oh, you don't want me to go back to? Okay.
No, not yet.
Okay. This?
Okay. So, all right, if we look at this again at the tetrapods, all right, you see here that amphibians is a modern group, right? But they're saying that back here, all right, the thing that would have lived around this time is amphibian. But again, the thing that would have lived back here kind of gave rise to everyone that's here. And so that's incorrect to say that Carnivore was an amphibian.
Next slide.
Okay.
Oops.
So this one is a little more complicated, but I want to show this to you because it has some times on it. So this group right here is all amphibians, and then over here you have mammals and then reptiles. All right, now everybody here is called the amniotes. Those are reptiles and mammals. So you can see right here, this line split into amphibians and then into the amniotes. Okay, so this Hynerpeton existed in the late Devonian. Okay, so when did he exist? About 365 million years ago. All right, but you see that the split right here is at about 350. But even with that said, like that's kind of close. Consensus is that Hynerpeton existed before the split, before the common ancestor split of, right here, of amphibians and the amniotes. All right, so again, to say that something that would have existed, and I can't say for sure that it was on this line, that it was the part of the lineage that gave rise to modern amphibians and the amniotes, but it would have existed around this time period. So to say that it's an amphibian is incorrect. And it's actually, just as much of a mistake to say it's any one of these groups over here, right? Like this is still a modern organism. And yes, it's true that it might have had traits in common with modern amphibians, but it would have had traits in common with all of its descendants. And they're just kind of picking ones, like, for example, like, I don't even know exactly how they would know for sure, but I'm sure there's evidence that it would have not had like the hard casing over the egg. But even if it did have that, that's one trait in common with amphibians, but it doesn't mean that it is this modern group that we have now today. Okay. Okay, so this I got from a website just online when I was looking. And so you see kind of them making that mistake again here of having that down here is a primitive amphibian, okay? But, again, whatever lived down here, its descendants included all of these groups, not just amphibians. And then another mistake here to say that this was a primitive reptile, because this ancestor would have had things in common with all of its descendants. So it's equal of a mistake to say this was a primitive mammal and kind of leaving out that it's related to these reptiles on this side over here. Okay, go ahead. Here's one from a free kind of like open source textbook that we found. So in the evolution of amniotes, that's again, those are reptiles and mammals. We're saying modern amniotes, which includes mammals, reptiles, and birds, evolved from an amphibian ancestor approximately 340 million years ago. Right? And then this is from another biology textbook, all right, where they say plants evolved from ancient green algae, which green algae are a modern group. So again, they're kind of making that mistake of saying that a modern group is their ancestor. Vascular plants evolved from mosses is not true. Mosses are a modern group. And they do not, vascular plants, another modern group, do not evolve from them. And amphibians gave rise to reptiles. Again, is that mistake of saying that humans evolved from chimpanzees. So it's incorrect to say that. Okay.
So, question,
Mhm.
so what would you suggest your students, that sentence on the bottom, amphibians gave rise to reptiles, what would be your best suggestion for how to phrase that?
Well, yeah, I would say like,
An amphibian-like animal, or how would you choose?
I guess I wouldn't say that because it's kind of close to what's already kind of a mistake. So I would say the ancestor to modern amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. Because that's what, and so now you're kind of including everybody in that. You're saying the ancestor to all of its descendants, right? Not an amphibian. You know, because it's kind of like a very misleading view of like the history and evolution of tetrapods. That amphibians came first, then reptiles and mammals. That's not like an accurate picture of like their history. Okay, so then here's this last one. This is from another great documentary called Your Inner Fish. This is really, really good. I love this one. We have the book, and I recommend watching it, but they're going to make the mistake again. So here they're going to show this like their nice little tree of life diagram they have here.
Okay.
Moment in the evolution of the human body. Trace your ancestry way back in time, and you'll find an ancient relative. A fish-like creature that crawled from the water onto land about 375 million years ago. Animals like this gave rise to amphibians, and more important to our story, reptiles. Over time, one line of reptiles gave rise to early mammals, and eventually to us. But before you get the idea, this was one smooth run.
Okay, so this person discovered a fossil called Tiktaalik, and this is like monumentous discovery in terms of like the evolution of limbs. And the documentary about it is still making that mistake of kind of saying that, and in the history of land animals, including us, that it was fish, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. So I hate to criticize it, but I guess I am. Okay, so if this is wrong, kind of like what Matt was asking, you know, how should we start stating things correctly? So our students and just people in general can have a more accurate picture of evolution. So at the very least, let's begin with some simple corrections. Okay. So instead of saying, you know, you have amphibians, reptiles, mammals, all right, I think a more accurate statement would be something like the ancestor to amphibians, reptiles, and mammals came onto land. This group split into modern amphibians and the ancestors of reptiles and mammals, which that group themselves split into modern reptiles and mammals. All right, go ahead. So why does this matter? All right, so I think that for evolution to make sense and people to kind of not poke holes in it, which evolution, you know, kind of let's face it, oftentimes is, like it's under a lot of scrutiny, that we need to have an accurate understanding of it, and if we have misconceptions, then communicating evolution to others in an inaccurate sense kind of is like fosters, like, you know, inconsistencies that people can potentially, you know, bring up when they're talking about is evolution true or not. So it starts with science educators having an accurate perception of evolution already, all right? And then another thing is that, like we gave this talk, like a previous related talk, and one of the things we talked about is kind of this perpetuation of this idea that there's like a ladder of life, and that you have more primitive creatures and more advanced creatures, and that just in terms of like evolutionary evidence, that's not really something that there's any evidence for, that that's the case. But maybe it might, if we say, well, first there was amphibians, and then that evolved into reptiles, and then into the pinnacle, the mammals, right? But that's kind of creating this perception that, you know, amphibians, they're, you know, they're not quite as great as what came later. they were the first guys around, right? Then you have reptiles, and it was pretty good, but not quite as great as what came with the end with mammals. But that's not an accurate perception or an accurate picture of what happened. So that kind of thinking can kind of, like if we have amphibians, reptiles, mammals, it kind of perpetuates, I think, this notion that mammals are at the pinnacle and then these other groups are less complex or more primitive, whatever that kind of means. And, I think it's just about kind of having an accurate picture of what evolutionary history is. And that, these groups are modern organisms with evolution and splits, and they're all modern organisms over here now. They're all successful in their own particular environments. So one last point I want to make, kind of like food for thought, is another kind of reason why applying a name of a modern group to something that lived in the past is problematic. Okay, so let's look at this. All right, so this is showing what we were looking at before, but it's showing some extinct organisms that lived a long time ago as well. And so you see here, all right, this is just showing the amniotes, right? So these are reptiles, all right, and these are mammals here. So it's kind of like the way they've drawn the lines here is a little odd, but right here is the branch that led to mammals, and then this branch right here, and they're kind of showing all of this detail on it, is the line that led to reptiles and birds. Okay? So why is it a problem to say that something that lived in the past is a reptile? Right? Well, what I would kind of argue is even the line, the lineage that gave rise to mammals in the past wasn't even really a mammal. All right? Go ahead. Okay, so let's look at this. So I just have the back here. So I have the mammal line and the reptile line. All right? These organisms are things like Adaphosaurus and Dimetrodon. They're like sail-backed organisms. And then this is a dinosaur, and this is ultimately going to modern reptiles and birds. Okay, but back then, so do you remember in the very beginning of the talk, I was kind of telling you that after an initial split, kind of as more time goes on, the more different things get. So if we look at this is, I don't know how like when this split occurred, but the organisms that are here, right, are definitely kind of much more close to the split than, go back one slide, than these organisms here. Like we've had all this time to diverge, right? Versus way back here when the split initially happened. So go ahead again. So this is the mammal line, and this is the reptile line. All right, but what's back here is actually much more closely related to each other, go back again, than mammals here and reptiles here, because they've been diverging for millions of years after this point. So you could argue that this organism here is more closely related to this organism than its descendants that occurred millions of years after. Okay? And so that's it kind of alludes to the fact that evolution is this dynamic thing that changes through time, so much so that relationships change through time as well, all right? And so, go ahead again. It's kind of like saying, right now, looking at snakes and lizards and saying, oh yeah, they're a very closely related group. But if we looked at the descendants of these groups, 200 million years into the future, they might be very, very different if they still have, ancestors or descendants that survive. Okay. So the relationship between modern mammals and reptiles is not the same as what it was for their ancestors that lived in the past. And further, it implies that mammals today are not the same as mammals that lived in the past. If you look at this lineage going back hundreds of millions of years, this is what was on the mammal side of things. Okay? And the Dimetrodon and Adaphosaurus group is often called mammal-like reptiles, but that term is actually a little problematic because it's just kind of very hard to apply a term to this that would be like, is it, I don't know that I like mammal like reptile or reptile like mammal either. Okay, so and so this is what would have been on the side. So these are the things we often call mammal like reptiles, but these are things that would have been very close to the split between reptiles and mammals. And so you see that the stuff on the mammal side of things looks really different from modern mammals, right? Go ahead. So you can go to 1250. This is showing an Adaptosaurus.
Our distant ancestors have come a long way. They've now conquered the land. The world's first giant reptiles have arrived. But they're not related to dinosaurs. Their descendants will be of a very different
So
kind.
you're trying to say that they're sensible animals. You can keep going.
Go to the next slide.
Oh no, just let it play.
Reptiles have now spread all across the globe. Edaphosaurus bask in the early morning sun. They're 3 meters long, as big as hippos, and like them, they're vegetarians. Life in their new Permian home is a constant battle with the elements. The climate swings between seasonal extremes, from burning summers to freezing winters. A new species of plant has evolved, able to withstand this cold, dry atmosphere. Primitive conifers. In this harsh world, creatures need ways to regulate their body temperature.
So you could.
Edaphosaurus are sluggish.
So it's kind of thought that their sail kind of helped with regulating temperature. And another thing that they would have had that kind of puts them on the mammal side of things is that their teeth are differentiated, which is like that's a normal trait that we have incisors, canines, molars. We can have different teeth compared to something like if you think of like a crocodile that have all shaped teeth in its mouth. And so if you look at this organism or another one called the Metrodon, you start to see this evidence of teeth differentiation. So, but again, they're calling these guys reptiles, but then they're on the mammal side of things. But I would kind of also argue it's kind of inappropriate to call them mammals as well, because that's a modern group. You could say they're on the mammal lineage, like that is true. That lineage would have given rise to modern mammals. But again, it's this idea that evolution is this dynamic thing that changes the relationship of things as time goes on. Okay, go ahead.
How old is this video?
It's from, I think, like 2003.
Because when I took paleobiology, they've done other discoveries. They call them non-mammalian synapses.
Yeah.
The term they use because of their texture.
Right.
Yeah, they have reptile characteristics, but they also have mammal characteristics.
Right. Yeah.
The call them reptile is incorrect. So that's the term they use, non-mammalian synapses.
Right. And I think that it's like I was saying, sometimes that doesn't trickle down to the general public or just us as like science educators.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can go ahead and go past this one.
Okay.
So in general, just some takeaways. So calling modern groups our ancestors paints this inaccurate picture that often kind of leads to this ladder-like view of life where we have, amphibians at the bottom, then reptiles and mammals. Go ahead. Evolution is dynamic. It causes change through time. And so kind of like the snapshot of what the Earth looks like now and the relationships between organisms that we have now, wouldn't be the same snapshot that you would have had 100 million years ago or 200 million years ago. And sometimes painting this oversimplified picture can lead to misunderstandings. But I think kind of having that, kind of like that small amount of education on how phylogenies work that I showed you, kind of really helps in understanding like how evolution progresses through time. Okay. All right, thank you.
Okay. So, I guess we'll take like a 5-minute intermission.
Okay.
And then we'll switch topics to cavemen.
Define caveman.
Okay, what?
You can see if there's anything in the chat.
Okay, okay.
You can do it. That's my thing. Okay, but- I think so.
Yeah.
Fancy.
There's Josh's.
That's why I think everybody
That's
needs
fun.
this book called Pre-Thinking,
Mhm.
which was written for biology teachers,
Mhm.
professors,
Yeah.
university. This ladder thinking. It's
Right.
confusing.
Mhm.
Look, I see, yeah, you're right. This is 101 textbooks.
Yeah.
Dangerous textbooks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Students get confused. That's why you show that amniotic, right? And then they see the mammal.
Mhm.
Now they're completely confused. How's that possible?
Yeah.
Because they're thinking,
Yeah.
what if
Yeah.
it's a branch? So,
Yeah, I don't think anyone taught it to me. I think I had to just kind of learn it on my own.
so what we're gonna do, once the schedule comes out, we'll send a survey.
Mhm.
And you can find that 1 hour block during the week where all the full-time teaching.
Yeah.
We can have 15 minutes, well, maybe sit down and discuss stuff like this. Teaching, give talks.
Yeah.
Looks like mostly people.
I didn't see any
Questions so far? We'll have time for questions at the end. I might not get through all my stuff.
Okay.
It just end 10 minutes.
Okay.
Before 7.
Okay.
Maybe you could just remind me if I
All
forget.
right. Do you want me to do the
Yeah.
advancing of the
Yes.
slides? Okay.
And I think if someone's in the waiting room, you can enter on here.
Okay.
I kind of forgot. This is also signed in as opposed.
Okay.
But I think everybody's in the waiting room. You could
All
have.
right.
Yeah. Huh? No, I wish. Anybody know what this is from? Any nerdy people? Yeah, it's Chrono Trigger. Yeah. Classic video game, but one of the worlds you go to is like a prehistoric caveman dinosaur time.
They put a cloaca on that thing. That's interesting.
It's
On
Japanese.
a pterodactyl?
Yeah.
Help you.
Could you briefly, just, if you're able to, how, from the dinosaur records, because really we either find not fully complete fossils. How do they say that this particular type of dinosaur led to these particular modern species? And this is what I'm kind of, because I don't.
Well, I can address that because I'll talk about
Yeah, just if you can mention, because
Yeah, I can address it at the.
I'm looking at those things, and I'm thinking, I remember it's been a while since I've done this, since 1988. So I can't remember very well. We had a really, well, and again, the concepts back then were a whole lot different.
Right.
No,
It's,
I don't
it is
think
tricky. It's not, we sometimes get stuff wrong. Like it took
Well,
me a long
plus, you
time to
know,
figure out
I mean,
like, the
you got
whale
your
station situation.
tectonic plates, and you got your fossils on this side, this one goes over this, and they say, you know,
Yeah,
So-
that'd be good to ask about.
Good.
Okay. Are you, can we go? I think it's good.
Oh, sure. Okay. Okay, I guess we'll
All right,
start
so we're
again.
going to continue again. So, you want to go to the next slide?
Okay.
So I'm going to talk a lot about cavemen. I think cavemen are pretty interesting. And I think maybe not for people in here, but for people in general, when people think of human evolution or human evolutionary history or prehistory, a lot of people get a picture of a caveman. So cavemen building clubs, living in caves, grunting, maybe running away from dinosaurs. There's a lot of cavemen in popular culture. So let's take a look at cavemen. So the first thing I want to talk about is where did this idea come from? I think I was really interested to dig into the history here, and I was kind of surprised by some of the really early representations of cavemen that I didn't know about. So people don't know for sure, but a really common idea that's out there is that cavemen came from this earlier concept called the European wildman, which was an archetype within medieval Europe from the 1100s to 1500s AD. And there's a lot of similarities between these wild men and cavemen. So they were portrayed as naked or almost naked, hairy, aggressive, often wielding simple weapons like clubs. They were common decorations on coats of arms, like this one here. There's also some statues of cavemen you can find throughout Europe. And this is some art of European wild men from the 1300s France, and it kind of tells a story of a wild man trying to capture like a civilized woman, and she's fighting him off, and then eventually the civilized men have to show up and kill him. You can see a lot of these ideas of this aggressive, kind of like aggressively sexual kind of creature that's common to cavemen was already here with the European wildman concept. It's not clear, like I tried to dig into this, who exactly coined this term caveman, but there are already representations of cavemen, cave-type people in media of the early 1900s. So for example, there were some adventure serials from 1918 by Edgar Rice Burroughs that were eventually put together into this novel, The People That Time Forgot. There was also a short story by Kipling, How the First Letter Was Written, about kind of caveman-type people and the origination of written language. And there were also some silent films. I didn't know about this, but this is kind of fun. This was a silent film by Charlie Chaplin from 1914 called His Prehistoric Past, where Charlie Chaplin kind of falls asleep and dreams about going back to the caveman times. And you can see there's a lot of similarities in how they're represented at this point, how people would think about it now. So you want to play that clip? Just click on the video. Yeah. He kind of just is there with his normal kind of happy stuff. He's making friends with this girl, cave woman, and so cavemen get married.
Tell me why I thought I just now you can leave. Sure. Okay.
See, you can see a lot of similarities there with how cavemen are are portrayed now, but I thought that was kind of fun. You can go to the next slide. So the concept of caveman has continued to be this popular and widespread kind of archetype in American culture up to the present day. There's a lot of movies about cavemen, comics, Far Side has a lot of caveman characters. And I think a lot of people who are pretty educated about prehistory might realize that this depiction is kind of bogus and fictional and exaggerated. But I think for a lot of people, this is actually what they think human prehistory was like, which is kind of alarming, but I think it's true. That if they think of it, they might think that, these were basically reflecting how our prehistory really was. Like Flintstones was basically a documentary. Go to the next one. So it kind of helps to dig down into, well, what is caveman supposed to mean? What do people mean by it? Now, it's a little bit ambiguous because sometimes people have depictions of cavemen and it's something that's obviously not a modern human. It could be a cousin of humans, like Neanderthals. Sometimes when they show cavemen, they're actually showing some representation of Neanderthals, which is also usually quite wrong. Or some other ancestral group like Australopithecus. But most of the time when people mention cavemen, they're talking about a member of our species from the past, prehistoric modern humans from what you could call the Stone Age era. So before you had cultures that smelted metals later on. So basically any human group prior to about 3000 BC would be classified as cavemen under the system. So in popular thought, how would you describe cavemen? I've talked about it a little bit, but I want to see, what do you guys think? What are some characteristics of cavemen? Brute? Yeah, brutish, kind of strong and mean, stupid, yeah, good. What else? Hairy, that's good, Anything else? Those are all good, yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's kind of getting into like showing them as like a Neanderthal or maybe another type of hominid, not exactly the same skull shape as a human. So these are some of the characteristics I came up with. Well, one thing is maybe they live with dinosaurs. For a lot of people, that's their picture of cavemen, as they lived alongside dinosaurs. They lived in caves, obviously. That's kind of where the name comes from. Their tools were basically rocks and nothing else. And then they were stupid and aggressive. So it turns out all of these points are wrong. Like none of these points actually accurately describe prehistoric humans. So let's take a look why. We're going to dismantle these points one by one to kind of take down the concept of a caveman as a real thing. So frequently, cavemen are depicted alongside dinosaurs. So this is really common. It was like a cartoon I liked when I was little. You have these smart dinosaurs that are kind of the dumb cavemen. There's a lot of movies where people fight with cavemen, also in the comics. And so even Sesame Street had this. So you want to click that video. This is Caveman Days from Sesame Street.
So we better not try to cross the street right now. And then the baby son would say, "Aga, wagga, 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 wagga," which means, "Why not?" And the caveman father would reply, "Boogie, woggle, woggle," which, well, there are many reasons, my caveman son. One of them, you see, there might be a very large dinosaur walking down the street towards us, and we don't want to get in his way. And matter of fact, look out! Ooh, that was a big one.
Go to the next one. Now, I think for a lot of you, I don't have to say this, but this is obviously not true, right? Like humans didn't coexist with dinosaurs unless you're counting birds as dinosaurs, which is fine. But I think people, when they're imagining this, they're not imagining people with pelicans, they're imagining people with, Triceratops and T-Rex and so on. So people and non-bird dinosaurs were separated by a huge amount of time. Like the non-bird dinosaurs went extinct about 65 million years ago, and modern humans, where you would say were our species, came about 300,000 years ago. So there's 65 million years separating non-bird dinosaurs from humans. And maybe you would think, well, this is just fantasy. This is just fun. Like no one actually believes that humans coexisted with dinosaurs. But I think considering how little, like Americans, for example, know about evolution and human evolution, I think this is too optimistic. So, for example, this is a Pew Research poll from 2018 on human evolution, and only 33% of Americans surveyed believe that humans evolved by natural selection. Okay? So it had an evolutionary perspective. 18% believe that they were just always present in their form, so basically no evolution ever happened. And 48% were kind of in the middle. But only a small portion of Americans kind of have an evolutionary perspective, an evolutionary biological perspective on human history. And this was kind of another fun survey from 2015 from YouGov.org, which surveyed Americans again and found that 41% of Americans surveyed believe that humans coexisted alongside dinosaurs. And only 25% said they definitely did not. 18% probably not, but kind of allowing for 16% undecided, right? So only 25% said it's totally not true. So I think this is actually a much more common belief than a lot of people give it credit for. Part of the reason why this belief is so prevalent is actually the fact that a lot of creationist groups have jumped on this bandwagon, this idea that humans did coexist with dinosaurs. It's interesting to survey the history of creationism because at other times they would have said that dinosaur fossils were just either misrepresented normal animals. You just found some elephant bones and called them a dinosaur, or they were placed there by Satan maybe to mislead people. But now a lot of creationists will present humans coexisting with dinosaurs. This is a book for kids. You can see you have Adam and Eve here coexisting with gorillas, but also dinosaurs, like Deinonychus. And another common thing you find in these creationist ideas is that everything before the arrival of sin was vegetarian. So you have these dinosaurs with teeth that have been adapted for tearing meat off the bone, but just living off of leaves. I guess you have like parasitic worms, like tapeworms, were just slithering around eating leaves as well. Okay, next one. As an example, we have Ken Ham. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's a religious leader. He built the Ark Encounter Museum, supposedly a replica of Noah's Ark. And in his design, there are tons of dinosaurs on board, which again is kind of an interesting theological question that God specifically wanted Noah to put these dinosaurs on board the ark so they would survive, and then right after they left, they all died, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but that would be a question for Ken Ham. So we've talked about this idea that humans lived alongside dinosaurs, that cavemen lived alongside dinosaurs. What about the cave part of cavemen? Now, if you look at a map of the world, this is showing cave density. In a lot of regions, there weren't really a lot of caves. So people didn't have the opportunity to live in caves as their homes. In fact, one of the few regions where you find extensive caves is in Europe. But for people that lived throughout most of Africa or South America or certain parts of Asia, there just wasn't caves. That wasn't a readily available way to make a home. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of the regions where you find extensive cave art and cave artifacts come from those regions with extensive cave systems. So most of the cave art in the world comes from like Europe, which is exactly the region where you find really high amounts of cave density. So where people were living by caves, they at least used them to create art. And I want to show you some of this cave art because I think it's kind of cool. Cave art dates from about 50,000 years ago and can depict a lot of stuff, including myths, stories, local wildlife. There's cave art all around the world, although maybe the greatest concentration is from Europe. Here's some cave art from tens of thousands of years ago in Australia. There's a lot of interesting art there. Famous one from France. And then there's also some from Colombia, at least 20,000 years old. So it's kind of common that, at least for people that live close to caves, they would use caves to create art. People also occasionally bury their loved ones in caves. Okay? So you can find cave burial, like this one, kind of sort of recently from Africa, from 600 years old. This one is from Spain, about 6,000 years old. And then this is a modern indigenous group, the Taraha people of Indonesia, that still bury their loved ones in caves that they live close to. So this is where they would bury their loved ones. So we know people sometimes created art in caves. They sometimes buried people in caves, but did they live inside caves? One way of answering that is to say, let's look at modern indigenous people. Modern people that are living in homes similar to what they would have lived in for the last few, thousands of years. Can you find people now that live in caves? And the answer is not really. This is the people I showed you before, the Taraha people. They bury their loved ones in caves, but they don't live in caves. They live in these houses that they build out of wood. It's just by those caves. This is like the closest one I could find. This is a group of people in Mexico, but they're kind of not really living in caves. See, what they did is they have like a crevice, and then they build like a little stone wall. So they're sort of creating a cave, but if you go inside, they have lots of cool stuff. It's not like it's just rocks in there. The only example of a group that kind of seemed like cave people was this group from the Philippines, the Pasiday people. I don't know if you've heard of them, but it's kind of an interesting story. Supposedly, the Filipino government found these living cave people, like practically naked, living inside caves. But it turns out that was just an elaborate hoax. The dictator of the Philippines wanted control of that land. So he grabbed some honest-to-goodness hunter-gatherer people that lived in the forest nearby, and he forced them to live in these caves naked, to take pictures of them, to pretend that they were cave people. Because that would give them the authority to control that land, to protect them. It was all just a big hoax. So there's no real example of widespread cave living in modern indigenous people. And if you survey people around the world who you could classify as Stone Age, who did not develop the smelting of metals, you find that they live in all kinds of different dwellings besides caves. Wood, clay, they build on the ocean, they can make houses out of snow and ice, all kinds of different dwellings besides caves. So there's no good reason to think that this is really different from what you would have had, say, 20,000 years ago. That back then everyone lived in caves, even people who didn't live anywhere near a cave. Now, I think part of the reason why they got this reputation as cave people is the fact that caves are good at preserving stuff. So if you have someone dies in a cave or they leave some tools in a cave, they'll tend to be protected there because they're not exposed to the elements. Like if you have a skeleton outside, after a couple hundred years, it probably will be eroded to nothing unless it's protected in some way. These are some ruins from Pakistan. You can see this used to be an elaborate city, but everything's been eroded away except for the foundation. And erosion could be a really powerful force. So this was taken in Alaska. This is using time-lapse photography over 9 days. But I just want you to see what happens to that bluff there in the video as this goes on. You can see just the constant wind and saltwater spray is just eroding the side of that cliff, just on the order of days. So erosion can be this really big force when things are left out in the open. And so human remains and artifacts, they survive well in caves. Like we have, here's some remains from Africa, from Morocco, dating back to 300,000 years ago. This is a cave in Israel that has human teeth dating to 200,000 years ago. They completely changed the timeline of human dispersal outside of Africa. This is a cave from Laos, 86,000 years ago, with human remains. So caves are really good at keeping stuff preserved, but that doesn't mean people lived in caves. It just means that caves are good at preserving stuff. So if people happen to be in a cave, or die in a cave or something, or have a little campfire in a cave at one point, those things tend to survive better to the present. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about technology. So cavemen are often portrayed as only having stone tools. That basically that's all that their technology revolves around is stones. So in other words, the Stone Age is taken very literally, that they basically just had stones. So for example, we have this comic here. Guys, look at this perfectly round sitting rock I found. I could sit here all week. Let's just let this work itself out in a few days. So people are using rocks for sitting on, or this cartoon here, they're using rocks to teach students, and the kids are also sitting on rocks. The rocks are everything to them. Here's a little clip from SpongeBob that shows prehistoric sponges and other marine creatures. Okay, so not only is he living inside of a cave, but basically the only thing he has in his house is a rock up on the shelf. So everything just revolves around rocks. And again, I think this misconception mostly comes from biases in the archaeological and fossil record. A lot of materials that people use decompose really fast, much faster than rocks. So here's some examples of fabrics, and you can see most of them decompose on the order of months or a few years. We have something like polyester, which again is like a plastic made from petroleum, so people would not have had that traditionally. But most materials like leather, linen, silk, they decay really quickly. And stone tools, or things out of stone, can last much longer, millions of years. Like these are some stone tools from 3.3 million years ago, from ancestors of humans. And again, if you survey modern groups that people traditionally label as Stone Age, because they didn't smelt metals, they didn't create bronze or iron or anything, you find that they use an assortment of tools and technology, not just stone tools. So here's some examples of indigenous people making tools out of wood and plant material. These are Mbuti hunters from Africa. They have wooden spears. They also hunt using these nets made from plant fibers. Kind of cool. They get animals to go towards them, and then they capture them on nets on land. Here's a totem pole carved from wood. We also have instruments made of wood, like there's a Dakota flute. You can build ships out of wood, like this bark canoe from Aborigines in Australia. And they can make tools out of a bunch of other things, including animal parts. Like here's a water flask made from buffalo bladder. Bladder is a really common thing to make a flask out of because it's watertight. It's kind of been evolved to hold water in it. Sometimes they also would inflate these and make them a little bouncing ball for kids to play with. Here's a rattle made out of a tortoise shell. Here's a case of an Inuit carving. So it's carved out of walrus tusk, and they carved a little walrus out of it, which is kind of fun. This is a weapon. So it's made out of wood, but then on the sides it's been covered in shark teeth as a way of kind of poking enemies. Here's a man from Papua New Guinea. He's decorated with feathers as well as shells. So there's all kinds of tools and technology that people use outside of just stone tools. And here are some other cool materials. So if you don't know, there's a lot of indigenous people that actually fish by poisoning the fish. So in this group in Cameroon, they get this plant, and then they get extracts from that plant that they put in the water, and that stuns the fish and gets the fish to rise to the surface so they can catch them. Animal dung is commonly used as a fuel for fire. And like I mentioned before, the Inuit build their house out of ice and snow. This is a Findelwoman, and traditionally they cover their skin and their hair with a combination of cream and clay. So they get cream from their domesticated animals, and they combine it with clay in that spot to protect their skin and hair from damage. So what about the idea that cavemen were dumb, mean brutes? So cavemen are often portrayed as really, really dumb, sometimes ridiculously so. Their strength was strength and not much else. And if they had a language, it was basically just grunts. So let's look at some examples of kind of really stupid cavemen. So this is from a movie, The History of the World Part 1. This is Stonehenge. It's kind of a funny joke.
The greatest calamity that could befall early man was the loss of fire. Fire, the mysterious phenomenon that cooked his food, heated his cave, and kept him alive. If he could not start a fire, he and his would surely die.
All right, and then here's another clip from SpongeBob of their discovery of fire. So they were so dumb that even their perception of pain was really slow. And then here's a little clip from, this is a FedEx commercial from 2006. This kind of really shows this grunty language associated with cavemen. Yeah, so we get the caveman being dumb, and you can see that one, they did make them look different from a human, so I think they were trying to make them look like a cousin or something. But you also got them coexisting with dinosaurs. So like the European wildmen, cavemen are usually seen as aggressive, brutish, and also this is a common theme, physically abusive with women. So for example, you've probably seen this, but there's a common picture or idea of cavemen kind of dragging women by their hair. And this is actually from a video game back from the old Nintendo era called Caveman games. And in this, the caveman isn't dragging a woman by the hair, but you'll see it is kind of bad what he's doing. You want to play that clip there? So the point is to try and get as far as you can, like throw her as far as you can. And this was kind of cool. So this comes from Buster Keaton. This is another silent short film called The Stone Age. And in this, this is the ending of the movie, but basically he's the hero caveman trying to rescue a female cave woman from a nasty, mean caveman. You can see what happens here. So this is the villainous caveman. And there's Buster Keaton. So I think it's kind of funny. That's how the movie actually ends. That's the ending there. But she's kind of like, my hero, as she gets dragged away. That might be the originator of the caveman dragging the cave woman by her hair. I don't know of an earlier representation, so that could be where it came from. Can I go on? So obviously, if you think about it logically, prehistoric humans were not dumb. It takes skills and intelligence, especially for an animal like a human, to survive, to thrive under natural selection. If you're hunting prey, the prey are oftentimes very smart themselves and strong and desperate to defend themselves against you. There's also predators around. Even today, there are predators which will hunt and kill humans. But back then, it probably was even more true. So in order to survive in this environment, our ancestors had to be smart in order to survive. We were not stupid. And humans as a species have existed for at least 300,000 years. And at that point, our skull had the same shape as it does now. Our brain would have the same size as it does now. We were the same species back then as now. So if you took someone from then and looked at their skeleton, it would look the same as the skeleton of someone living today. So they would have the same capacity for intelligence and language as someone alive today, even though culturally they would have been different. And this is an example. Here's a human skull of our species with the same brain case size from Greece from 210,000 years ago. And again, if you look at cultures today, which are classified as Stone Age, you find that they have a lot of sophistication and intelligence. They have rich mythology and folklore, and they have skills that are as impressive as a human living in a dense industrialized society. For example, these are the Korowai people of Papua, Indonesia. And they live in forests, and there they construct these really tall, impressive tree houses that have to require a lot of architectural skill in order to make them. They're stable, they're tall, and it takes a lot of ingenuity and know-how in order to produce something like this. So the fact that they don't smelt metals doesn't mean that they're not sophisticated and intelligent just like humans anywhere else. And kind of in the last couple decades, the scientific world has kind of shifted a little bit like this. We've kind of paid more attention to indigenous knowledge and what people know in these small-scale societies. And what we find is if you study their knowledge, you find that they actually know a lot. So, for example, there's been a lot of papers of indigenous knowledge of their local plants, their local animals, the species that they know, the medicinal qualities of the plants in their area. You know, indigenous knowledge is saving our iconic species. I did a lecture on cryptozoology before, and one of the things I talked about was that scientists were actually using indigenous knowledge to find new species. Because sometimes the people of that area know about species that scientists don't. So we turn to them and use their knowledge to help identify species we're not aware of. So just over time, there's been an increase in papers like this that have used indigenous knowledge and talked about it, especially in areas like biology and ecology. They're kind of growing in other fields as well. So if you actually study people around the world, instead of just assuming that they're dumb, you find that they are intelligent and they know a lot of stuff. So this kind of brings me to my last point. Why does any of this matter? I've been kind of poking holes into the concept of cavemen, like what people commonly attribute to cavemen, but why does any of this matter? So why are beliefs about cavemen important? Well, part of this, I would argue, is because of how popular and widespread this idea is. These are all movies about cavemen from all over the world. You have movies from India, Japan, Mexico, France. A lot of them portray cavemen as they're traditionally thought of, as dumb, as coexisting with dinosaurs. So this is a really kind of popular archetype that exists across many cultures around the world. And in the past, this concept of Stone Age was really popular, particularly among historians and even among anthropologists. But over time, especially anthropologists have moved away from this concept, from this label, because the Stone Age implies this simplistic linear progression of culture that most cultural anthropologists would not endorse anymore. If you label a group as Stone Age, it's giving so much importance to metallurgy, to what kind of metals they have, to their ability to create bronze or iron, and ignoring every other aspect of the culture. Differences in language, social organization, religion, the method of subsistence, how they're getting food, whether they're nomadic or not, their group size, and every other aspect of their tools and technology is all ignored, and you're only paying attention to, do they use stone tools or do they use metal tools? So for example, the Aztecs and the Mayans, with populations in the millions, really densely populated, organized agricultural societies with a lot of social stratification, would be considered Stone Age. because they used stone tools. They didn't smelt bronze or anything like that. The Aztecs did a little bit, but that was way later, and the Mayans didn't. And the Aztecs didn't for most of their history. So they'd be labeled with Stone Age alongside a group like this. The Yali people of Papua New Guinea, with a really small population size of about 20,000 people for the whole group, for everyone speaking that language, living in really small groups within a forest. I don't think it makes sense to attach the same label to both of these societies, because there are so many differences among them. And in the past, anthropologists and historians and people today have viewed human societies and human cultural evolution on a linear scale of progress. And I talked a lot about, in the last lecture we did before, of why this is an inappropriate view of thinking in terms of biological evolution. But it's also inappropriate when attaching it to cultural evolution of human societies. But this is how a lot of historians have previously seen things. You had the Stone Age, and the Bronze Age, Iron Age. You had these societies kind of transitioning from foraging to pastoral, agricultural, industrial. You have human progress as this linear trend from stone tools, bronze tools, iron tools, steam engines, all the way up to us today, of course, is the pinnacle. But I think this view, trying to think of diverse human groups on a linear scale, is inherently bigoted and wrong. I mean, we can't think about it that way. If you view humans and human groups according to evolutionary theory, then you view all human groups as modern, as all endpoints on a single family tree. You can break this down genetically. So here's a genetic family tree of different human groups. This is based on their Y chromosome. Or you can break down humans in terms of language phylogenies, group them that way. But you see, in both of these instances, every human group that's alive is the endpoint of a tree. None of these languages are ancestral. These are all modern languages. They're the endpoints of trees. So this is an evolutionary perspective of human cultures. And I think making untrue generalizations about our Stone Age ancestors, it makes it all too easy to extend those generalizations to humans today that you could classify as Stone Age, that have stone tools. So if you think of our ancestors of, well, they're Stone Age, they're dumb, they're horrible, they're aggressive, I think that could easily bleed over into having a similar view for small-scale societies that never developed bronze or iron. So I would argue that this myth of the cavemen should go extinct, or at least people should realize that the concept is fantasy, that it's made up, that there was never a human group, that humans were never really like this. It's as fantastical as fairies or elves. Okay. All right, so we'll see how far I can get into this one. We'll try and quit like 10 minutes early to give time for questions. But I want to also talk a little bit about the fossil record and how incomplete it is. We'll talk a little bit about dinosaurs. I think a lot of people, if you know kind of about fossils and evolutionary history, you might realize that the fossil record is incomplete, that there's a lot of gaps, right? Like these are skulls representing human evolution and our lineage, and there's lots of gaps. Like we don't know exactly where Homo sapiens came from. There's some species that just kind of appear as a little dot, and then they're gone. We don't know how all of these groups are connected. So there's a lot of gaps in the fossil record. But it might surprise you to know how incomplete that fossil record is. So as an example, let's take a look at dinosaurs. And I'm going to ask a simple question. How many different dinosaurs lived on the planet in total? Different species of dinosaurs. To answer this question, it kind of gets complicated. Okay? But we can use birds, which are living dinosaurs, to help us answer this question. So there's about 10,000 documented species of birds living on the planet right now. But the number's probably closer to 18,000. There's always a lot of species that have not been found, that have not been documented, but we know about 10,000 of them. Now, did dinosaurs, did they rule the earth as much as birds currently rule the earth? And terms of species diversity. Commonly, we think of dinosaurs as ruling the planet, as being the major land vertebrate group. You know, the age of the dinosaurs, the Mesozoic, when dinosaurs ruled the earth, right? So it's possible that they even would have more diversity than birds do today, if it's true that they did rule the earth. But we're going to use the conservative number of 10,000 species, which we associate with birds. So what this means is if you took a snapshot of time, at any given moment in time, dinosaur diversity would be in the ballpark of 10,000 species. If we're assuming their diversity was comparable to birds, which we call that now the age of mammals, even though birds have at least twice as many species as we do. So, but the complication comes from the fact that dinosaurs didn't just exist as a snapshot, they existed for a very long period of time. And in fact, they existed from 245 million years ago up until about 66 million years ago, a time span of 179 million years. So for that whole time period, you would call representatives of that group dinosaurs. They all get that label. So over that length of time, over that more than 100 million years, some dinosaurs would go extinct, and other species would diversify, kind of like what Lena was talking about. They would diverge and become new species. So the dinosaurs of the Triassic are different from the dinosaurs of the Jurassic, and those are different from the Cretaceous. This is just showing a little family tree here of some dinosaurs closely related to birds. You can see splits that happen over the span of this more than 100 million years. So how can you sum up all the dinosaur species that would have existed over 179 million years? So I had to do a little bit of math on this. And if you look at birds, we can find their rate of speciation. What's the rate at which they, over geologic time, create new species? On average, a lineage of bird produces new species every 4.76 to 5.88 million years. You can also express this as a speciation rate of 0.17 to 0.21 new species per lineage per million years. So that basically means if you were looking at 5 lineages, like 5 species of birds, one of those would diversify into a new species over a million years on average. And this seems to be accurate. These are actually Darwin's finches over here. And you can see over the timeline of 2 million years, there was a lot of diversification and forming new species that happened. Birds are kind of average with respect to this. So this is the birds graph here. Maybe they diversify a little bit faster than, say, a mammal or a lizard or snake, but pretty close to vertebrates in general. So again, if we use the most conservative estimate of 5.8 million years for speciation to occur, that means if you do the calculation, over 179 million years, there should be 304,422 different species of dinosaurs. So using these numbers we take from birds, there should be about 300,000 different dinosaurs that have existed over that time span. We'll do one more forward. If you use a less conservative estimate, you get 677,000 total species of dinosaurs. If you could do one more. And again, this is a ballpark figure, not a precise estimate. We can say in the ballpark of 300,000 to 700,000 different species of dinosaurs. And just to give you a comparison, right now there's about 600,000 species of arachnids, 200,000 species of mollusks just right at this moment, 500,000 species of flatworms, vertebrates in general about 80,000. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, or it seems unreasonable to conclude that this number could be accurate. Yes?
Can I disagree?
You can.
I think one factor that is missing is the size.
Yeah, that's true.
Smaller species are more microhabitat, mispartitioning, etc. So it creates more capacity for speciation. So
Yeah.
I think the data needs to be standardized, at least in pilots.
Right. I think that's a good point. I would also say that in general, larger species would preserve better than smaller species. So I think the fossil record is already biased in favor of larger dinosaurs. So we don't actually know the average size of a dinosaur. It's already biased towards the larger end of things. But I think it's a good point. But I don't think it would change the numbers super drastically. So if we conclude, if we kind of take for granted now, that dinosaur diversity is likely in the ballpark of 300,000 to 700,000 total species, how many species do you think we have found? Anyone want to make a guess?
890.
Okay. Very precise
Price is
number.
right, 895.
$1, anybody?
$1.
Okay. Okay, you want to go on? So I was pretty close. So according to the American Museum of Natural History, we found 700 described dinosaur species. So compare 700, right, to maybe 500,000. 700 is a drop in the bucket, you know? And there's new species discovered all the time. About every 2 weeks, there's a new species of dinosaur. This was just from last year. This was a cousin of Ankylosaurus, and then here's another species, a new sauropod that was discovered in Spain just last year. So we're discovering new species of dinosaurs all the time. We've only discovered about 700. And in fact, that 700 is probably not accurate either, because most of these we don't really have a good skeleton for. In fact, only about 20% have been identified from a nearly complete skeleton. The actual number of dinosaur species is probably quite a bit below 700. According to one estimate, there's only about 336 dinosaur species that are actually valid species. A lot of them are just you find one little fragment of bone, and those could be from a species you know about. So maybe we only know about 336 out of the hundreds of thousands that existed. Something that was surprising to me was looking at Ankylosaurus, which was actually my favorite dinosaur. I would have assumed that we at least had one Ankylosaurus if you put all the fossils together. But we don't. There's not even one complete skeleton, even if you put everything together. Ankylosaurus, the genus, has only one known species taken from 3 skulls and a few partial skeletons. But there are major parts of the body we've never found, like the pelvis and the feet. So these reconstructions of Ankylosaurus are guesswork. We've never found these parts of this dinosaur. They're guessing based on what they know about cousins of Ankylosaurus. For example, we only have one tail, so the tail gets a lot of attention, but there's only one in the whole world that we've ever discovered. It's this one right here. So the fossil record for dinosaurs is, I think, a lot more sparse than a lot of people realize.
How do they know that's a tail?
How do they? I think they found it in association with a partial skeleton. And there are cousins of Ankylosaurus that maybe have the tail connected to the rest of the skeleton better. So I think they're kind of guessing. But I think they found it in one of the associations with one of the other skeletons. I think it's reasonable. But it is, they only have that one. That's true. So based on these numbers, our current catalog of dinosaurs only includes about 0.05% to 0.2% of the species that actually lived on the planet. So 99.9% or so of the species we've not discovered or cataloged. So the vast majority of the diversity remains undiscovered. And probably most of it will never be discovered because of the low probability of fossilization. Because for fossilization to occur, you need to have a very specific sequence of events. Like you have a dinosaur die, and then before the skeleton decomposes, because it will decompose over time, before it decomposes, it usually has to get buried by something, like mud. And that cuts it off from the atmosphere. And it slows down the rate of decomposition and allows time for minerals to come in and replace the bone with rock, basically. But this is a very kind of like 1 in a million event. And in fact, we know this is true. So a recent study hypothesized where they found that about 2.5 billion T-Rexes lived on the planet. So it was actually a very common dinosaur over the 3 million years that this species existed. But this huge population, 2.5 billion T-Rexes, only produced about 40 fossils. So what this shows us is that the probability of an animal like a T-Rex getting preserved is very low. It's only about 1 in 63 million chances. This means that for any dinosaur that has just a few million individuals in the species or a few 100,000 individuals in the species is likely to not fossilize. The probability is that it will not be fossilized and found by a person. So this situation with dinosaurs may seem really bad, but comparatively, it's actually really great. The fossil record of dinosaurs is great compared to some other types of organisms. And the reason for this is dinosaurs are big animals, and they have hard, bony skeletons. And those skeletons can resist decomposition for up to 200 years. And in general, that's what you find in the fossil record. Organisms with hard parts like bones or shells tend to fossilize a lot better. They have a much more complete fossil record compared to other animals. So you find a lot of vertebrates and shelled mollusks and arthropods. Their fossil record tends to be pretty good. But now let's consider a flatworm. So here are some soft, squishy flatworms. And when they die, they decompose in a few hours. Okay? So unless they go through a process that will preserve them in the few hours after they die, they're just going to turn into goop and disappear. So the probability that something like this will fossilize is much lower than something like a dinosaur. And despite being a very diverse group, like it's estimated flatworms have between 25,000 and 500,000 species right now, so millions of species, tens of millions of species throughout their lineage, throughout their geologic history, the entire history of flatworm evolution comes from 2 to 3 total fossils. Not fossil species, 2 to 3 specimens. One of them there's debate about, that's why it's 2 to 3. This is one of them. These are some tapeworm eggs that were fossilized in fossil shark poop. Okay? But that's all we have. We just have those 2 to 3 fossils to represent the tens of millions of species that likely existed throughout their evolutionary history. And this is true in general for soft, squishy organisms. They don't have hard parts that make them likely to fossilize. So their fossil record is incredibly spotty. So it's very rare you find a fossil jellyfish or an octopus or a sea squirt, kind of just a bag of fluid, or an earthworm. These are incredibly rare and valuable fossils because it just doesn't happen very much. This also means that we can't confidently state much of anything about their abundance or their diversity through time because we get so little information about soft, squishy animals. We don't know how jellyfish diversity or abundance has changed through time, or octopus or sea squirt or so on. That's a huge gap in our knowledge. You think we should stop? We could stop. Do you want to? We go? Okay. Well, we can stop there. Do you want to go to the? I had a little bit more, but I can move. We can move it to part 3. And go to some sources there at the end. All right. And then any questions? We can take questions or. Lena, do you want to see if there's anyone in the chat that has a question? Anybody here? Questions on anything? Yeah, it's kind of showing he's muscular, but then he's drinking alcohol. Any questions from the chat? Questions?
Why most of the fossils recovered?
You say why?
You said that the fossils, not all of them were recovered.
That's right. Yes. Well,
why weren't they?
Well,
why weren't they retrieved?
Because
we're able to retrieve.
Right. So part of that could
Thank
be
you.
that
Thank you to the people in the chat.
Their body was damaged while they were fossilized.
That's
so not
good.
all of the body actually
Thank
got
you, Angela.
affected. Or it could be that they were fossilized complete, and then through geological activity, that fossil was partially destroyed. Any of those
Thank
are
you.
true. I didn't talk about it, but the more distant you go in the past, the more likely the fossil will be destroyed just by normal geological activity before it gets to the present. So we tend to get the most complete fossil record is closer to the present day because it's less likely that it was possible to be destroyed. Yeah.
And a lot of the areas is not even accessible.
That's right.
Cretaceous is very few
Right.
outcrops.
Yeah.
Makes it harder to
Right.
go dig there.
And like, I was going to talk about this. I'll just show you this graph because I think you'll like this. You'll appreciate it. Okay, there we go.
Thank you, everyone in the chat.
That this is the apparent species diversity, kind of showing the classical view that species diversity increases over time. But this is the geological map area that's available to us. So how much, as you can see, we have a ton of tertiary rock available to us, but much less as you go in past, which that creates its own bias. So it's very hard to judge species diversity through long periods of geological time.
Thank you,
Because
Cassie.
diversity is highly correlated with how much available, and almost all the rock we have available to us is very recent. So that creates a huge bias in the fossil record. That's true.
Like the Tiktaalik you mentioned,
Yeah.
there's three possible sites, right?
Yeah.
Pennsylvania,
Right.
Greenland,
Yeah.
and Ellesmere Island.
Yeah.
and
And it's also that there's probably a lot of fossils that if we dug really far underground, we could get to.
Thank you, Caitlin.
We're just reliant on what's exposed on the surface. And a lot of that is biased towards recent stuff. Any other questions? Any questions in the chat?
No, they're just saying thank you, I think. Let me.
Any other questions here? Yes.
Oh, wait, we do have a question.
Oh, okay.
Okay, let me see. Let me see if I can get this person's
There
name.
was a one.
Oh,
that we
okay.
told you. Yeah,
Okay,
go ahead.
we'll go to your question.
How do we know T-Rex forward? Really?
Yeah,
How do we know?
that's a good question. Like, there was some guesswork involved. I think it had to do with like the fact that we did find, like relative to other dinosaurs, we did find a lot of specimens. Like I think it was like 60 or so pretty well defined skeletons of T-Rex. So if you kind of do the backwards calculation that I did, you find quite a bit of fairly complete skeletons of T-Rex compared to other dinosaurs, and how long that species persisted over time, if you would call it T-Rex. It's kind of a guess based on it. But that I think basically they were saying that compared to other dinosaurs, it's likely to have a pretty large population size because of how many good fossil skeletons we have in T-Rex compared to.
Was that, if that's, the T-Rex being an apex predator in size, then what?
Yeah.
Populations of all the
Right.
aliens must have really been.
Yeah.
stratosphere.
Yeah, it is interesting. That's true. Yeah.
What
I
is
think it's
the-
also a function of geographic spread. So I think if T-Rex has occupied a very large amount of land, then that could also explode.
Well, what was the time period that they said they existed?
I think, was it 3 or 4 million years? I know I had it in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then if you did, I mean, just as like a comparison, if you did like a comparable, like an apex predator now
Yeah.
and their current population size,
Right.
yeah, would
I think it works because they lived for kind of a long time where they'd be classified as the same species, and they had a pretty big geographic distribution. So I think both of those together made it that in total they had a high population size. The density might have been low though at any given point in time. Because yeah, you're right, apex predators tend to have low populations.
Wayne asked, what time period did people leave Africa and disperse throughout the world?
Well, I don't want to get in trouble because last time I had a talk, I kind of had a little pushback about this. But this is actually a
Question?
what was the time period for people dispersing throughout the world?
From leave Africa.
Yes, and I kind of really like talking about this with my students in lecture because I think it's a really cool example of how drastically scientific stories can change. Because if you look at a textbook on human dispersal from like 20 years ago, their timeline is completely different from the timeline that it is now. Like for a long time, people thought that human dispersal out of Africa was at the very furthest 100,000 years ago. But then they found, just a few years back, they found human remains in Israel. That was the cave I was showing, of 200,000 years ago. So that meant that out of Africa migration was not 100,000 years ago, it was double that far in advance, at least 200,000. And we say at least because you don't know you're going to find new discoveries all the time. Like Europe, people went into Europe a lot earlier than people had previously thought. I think it used to be like 10,000 or 15,000, but now there's evidence it's like 50 or 60,000. Migration into Australia was like 50 or 60,000, and before it was thought to be much more recent than that. And then there's the dispersal into the Americas, which for a long time, there was the Clovis first hypothesis was the dominant view that humans only came into the Americas 12,000 years ago, end of story. And then since then, they found a number of earlier sites before Clovis that have changed the timeline, including evidence in San Diego that is more than 100,000 years old, which that one gets a lot of debate about. But there was a lot of sites in the ballpark, I think, of 40 to 50,000 that are not debated. And I even think the one in San Diego is good. I think people were here more than 100,000 years ago. But the timeline throughout the world has completely changed over the last 20 years. Yes?
And plus, it's just not one migration. It's
Yes.
multiple.
That's right.
One
Yeah.
migration went Central
Yeah.
Asia, and then
Yeah. Totally. And you even see that with the genetic studies. You can see that evident in the genetic studies of Native American people. But I think it's a good lesson that people shouldn't be so in love with their model that they resist evidence to the contrary. I think that did happen with American archaeologists, that they resisted changing the timeline. And that resistance didn't really happen in the rest of the world, where they were kind of like, oh, Asia was much earlier than we thought, and Australia was much. I think they accepted a lot more. But for some reason, in America, the Clovis first hypothesis had such a hold on people that I think they ended up being bad scientists as a result.
But the key is everything is coming out of Africa.
Yes, that's true. All the earliest stuff is out of Africa. It's just the dispersal out of Africa happened earlier than we thought. And it's also interesting because other hominids also dispersed out of Africa as well, like Neanderthals did, and Denisovans. And you have even Homo erectus dispersed quite a ways out of Africa into Asia, which is kind of cool. That there was a lot of different hominid groups kind of all mixing around the world. Anything else?
I think that's all. Jeffrey
Okay.
Cohen said, I have a question,
Okay.
which
but
you
no
can
question?
ask if you want. Go ahead.
Sure, I do have a question. Early on, when we were talking about evolution and showing the tree and how it continually split, and show the relationship between different relatives or species. My question is there any evidence, or theoretically, is it possible that different branches of the tree came together and bred to become a single branch where the two parent branches had gone extinct? And if there is evidence of that, how would that be interpreted when you see that? Would the assumption be that it came from a single parent, or how would that be interpreted? And is there evidence of it ever happening?
Yeah, I think there is evidence of that happening. That would be, but theoretically, that would happen in groups that are fairly closely related.
Unless you're talking about like bacteria or something.
Right, that's
where
true.
They can transfer genes between really distant relatives.
Yeah, so kind of like the concept of a species,
Yeah.
it kind of like you can have different definitions of what qualifies organisms as different species, and kind of what works for large vertebrate animals is slightly different than what you would have for plants versus what you would have for bacteria, can be very different because they can reproduce with very, very different groups. But in general, like let's say you were talking about something like animals, that they were kind of diverging over time, but then let's say that separation went away and they came back together. Typically, there's different things that can kind of keep things isolated, even if they come back together, as long as they've been separated for enough time. So you're not going to have, humans and sharks being able to produce a successful, fertile offspring.
Right. So
once a certain amount of divergence happens, it's it's not possible for organisms to kind of recombine again. But yeah, definitely if they're a fairly closely related group, two closely related groups, it's possible that that would be called, that they're creating like a hybrid. And sometimes, yeah, that can kind of go back to becoming one species again.
That kind of happened with Neanderthals, actually.
Yeah.
Neanderthals, people sometimes think of as a different species, but they weren't. And the evidence for that is because they diverged from us, but then in Europe, they came back together and they meshed with us. And so a lot of humans that originate from Europe have, like probably me, would have Neanderthal DNA because Neanderthals ended up mixing back and getting lost into the larger population of our own species. But they didn't, it's like a weird thing of like, do you go extinct if you end up just kind of like merging with another lineage?
Yeah. In a way, it's kind of like going extinct because like that.
As a separate isolated group.
Like genetically, that combination of genes and everything is now gone.
Right.
Right. And so, you can kind of look at
it probably happens a lot
like patterns over geography to kind of tell you if something, kind of like what you're talking about with Neanderthal, and it's also that you could look at patterns like DNA evidence to tell you that like Europeans might have, things we would associate with Neanderthals, but maybe you wouldn't find that in groups from Africa or groups from Asia.
But they have their own stories just like that too.
Yeah.
All right. Any other questions?
Thank you.
I have one.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Wayne. With the dispersal of humans leaving Africa, was that during the period of Pangea?
No, that would have been a long time after Pangea. The continents would have looked pretty much the same as they do now, but one big difference is that you would have had periodic ice ages, which would have affected the sea level during that time. So at periods when it was, for example, an ice age, that would tend to cause sea levels to drop, which would make it easier for people to move between areas. So for example, during the last ice age, people could just walk from Asia to North America. You could also walk from mainland Europe into the UK, because that would have all been one landmass back then. So that would have had a big impact on dispersal, kind of like changing sea levels. But that would be the main difference you would see over 200,000 or 300,000 years. The continents wouldn't change that much, but you would have had a lot of changes in sea level and also the ability to move because of glaciers and glaciers retreating. If that makes sense.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? All right, I guess that's it. We will stay if anybody needs it in the chat. Otherwise, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. You did sign in, you have a sign